Afros and Audio's Black History Month interview series. My name is Talib Jasir. I'm the founder and CEO of Afros and Audio Podcast Festival and Vanguard Podcast Network. I'm excited to spotlight 29 outstanding indie podcast creatives and professionals who answer the call to be a part of this series. My guest today is Josh Wilcox. Welcome and thank you for being here. How are you?
Much appreciated. Feeling really good. Very honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today, man. First of all, I want to talk to you about what your work is. And so can you share with us your journey into podcasting, how you came to establish the Brooklyn Podcasting Studio?
Sure. So I started Brooklyn Podcasting about 5 years ago, but my podcast journey really goes back to, I'm originally an audio engineer, still an audio engineer. I've been an audio engineer for going on like 15 years now. I went to school for it, Full Sail in Orlando. I worked in music for a pretty long time. And that's where my dreams were always, it's where I always hoped to be and I hope to stay at. But about 7 or 8 years ago, for a lack of better words, even after having some decent accolades, some things I could be proud of, it was never quite paying the bills the way I wanted it to. I always still had a 9-to-5. What it was, I was kind of looking for like a shift and a way for me to still be able to use my audio skills and still be able to make money and finally wean myself off of having this 9-to-5. And long story short, I'd been listening to podcasts before podcasting was like really a thing that was on everybody's mind. I'd been listening to podcasts since like, I want to say like maybe 08, maybe 09, that early. So, and one day I was just on a train and realized that just listening to it, I was like, oh, I could totally produce one of these. It's just audio. And at this point in time, video podcasting, some people did it, but it wasn't really a thing that people did or the way it is now. And I ended up applying for a gig with a pretty big podcast at the time called The Human Experience. And they pretty much it was like an interview format show. We interviewed a lot of the like really like nerdy niche experts that you may see on like Joe Rogan now, and some entrepreneurs like Grant Cardone, the Iceman, Wim Hof, who's like famous for doing like ice cold plunges and stuff like that. So we interviewed like a lot of those people before they even sort of blew up, but it was a pretty big show and we averaged like anywhere between, like depending on the guest, like 16,000 to 100,000 listens per episode in like a 2 to 3 week period. So I was really fortunate to get my start there. And after about 2 years of working with the host, it was really just me and him and a couple of interns every once in a while. We went from there. He was going through some things, long story short, and wanted to quit doing the show when I wanted to keep doing the show because we had made all this progress. Obviously, we had a huge audience, but I wanted to stay in the podcast world. I always thought that I really believed that this would be my path. And I realized that I'd been editing audio for a long time and I realized I was good at it, but I was also good at helping with the content side of things as well too. I was looking for a job and came across the first owner of Brooklyn Podcasting Studio, and he hired me to pretty much run the entire thing. And even in the beginning, even though I wasn't the official owner, pretty much everyone sort of saw me as the owner because the owner was pretty much non-existent the entire time. But he pretty much let me build that thing from jump and with all of the autonomy in the world. And even though we're no longer business partners anymore, and I took it over in 2020, even though we're no longer business partners anymore, I took it over in 2020. I still thank him for giving me that opportunity. And we have been able to do and work with some really amazing clients. From pick your media company, we've probably worked with them. At this point, for me, the thing that really always gives me the most pleasure is being able to work with people that really don't have any notoriety or really aren't known to people at all, and being able to help them with their content. So that's kind of my journey of how I got to be here.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. That support, right, and an audio engineer in a studio house is something that a lot of people, whether they know or don't know, that they have access to. It supports the sustainability of what they're working on. Mm-hmm. And so to make visible, right, what is sometimes invisible to people, we know creatives often work in silos, right?
Yeah.
And they also don't reach for support, whether they, again, know their support to reach for, or just feel like it's just me, right? And so when you say, and this is why I'm asking this question kind of off the cuff, sure, is that when you say it's been really rewarding in a way to work with folks who don't necessarily have the notoriety and are starting out a thing and are really passionate and want to do it, but it's that editing, it's that sound design, it's all that they don't know that says, you know what? I did 2 episodes, I'm out because this ain't it. Mm-hmm. What is that for you? What part of that says, you don't have to leave this space. There is support. And whether it's me or other audio engineers, or what do you feel like we need to do to get people in the mindset that you don't have to do everything? There is support out here. There is access to it out here.
I think it really comes down to, it's a really broad question, but it's a really great question though. And I think what it is that people need to realize, and I realized this myself as a business owner, is like, if you want to do podcasting seriously and you really want it to be something for you and you want it to be something long-term and sustainable, this thing has to be run like a business. And I really try to stress that to people all the time. And what I mean by that is that you have to treat it like it's a business. What is a business? A business is an organization. And an organization requires more than just you. So the idea, even if you are wildly talented at doing all the jobs and all the things, it's just not possible if you actually want to reach a certain height or a certain level of sustainability. And I think that's something that people really have a hard time understanding. And I think it's pretty natural, to be honest with you, because I struggle with this as a business owner myself. It's just like, we've all been employees, and before you even try to build something on your own, you don't really know what it's like until you're actually trying to do it. And it's really no different when you're starting a podcast, and you're just not going to be able to do it alone. You're going to need help. And that's one of the things, like the reason why I have the amount of clients that I've had is because I try to really point that out to people from the jump. Like whenever, like one of the things I'm really sort of known for when people meet me for the first time, when they come into the studio, and like full disclosure, like we know each other partially through Raphael, who of White Label American Podcast. He came through my studio for the first time. When he came through, I pointed out all the things that I could personally see with his content that he can improve upon. And I think having somebody like that who is willing to give you that sort of constructive criticism and constructive feedback is really, really important, because a lot of times we're not going to be able to see it for ourselves. And I think a lot of times podcasters struggle with the fact that like you are doing something new. So the expectation that you're going to do this like 100% perfectly right off the bat is not really going to be the case. Like I always jokingly tell people who are brand new, like your first episode is going to be your worst episode. So don't worry about it. You want to try to be as prepared as possible. Obviously, you want to try to get off on the right foot. But I think having that support and realizing that you are going to need people is very important. Like it's one of the things I stress is for people to try to build their team, because you're going to need help in all these phases, whether it comes down to the preparation for episodes, whether it comes down to the marketing for episodes, which most people will tell you that's not a fun thing, and they always try to pass that off to somebody else. And then there's the production side of things, which is what I primarily handle, but I also help people with their content as well.
Yeah, it's important. And I just want to say to you that the importance of someone who cares, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to be transactional and say, here, pay me for the hours that you're here and go away. Yeah. And then next client, right?
You're literally taking the words right out of my mouth. Like I literally tell people all the time, like I didn't start Brooklyn Podcasting Studio. I know this sounds weird, but like I really didn't start Brooklyn Podcasting Studio to record people. Like I came there to be a resource for people. And granted, even at the beginning, like I couldn't quite articulate myself the way that I could in terms of like how succinct my advice can be for people the way that it is now. But I've personally, having worked in other studios, specifically when I was working in music, like it was very transactional, just like you just said. It's like people, you come in, I didn't want to be a studio where people come in, record, and then they get the hell out. Like that's, to me, like that's not interesting for me, especially if I know that what you just did was not all that great, or I can obviously see things that you can improve upon. Like, why would I keep that to myself? Because if you end up being more successful and your podcast keeps growing, that makes me look good too. To me, it's a win situation. And to really operate otherwise as like a studio owner, or even just as an audio engineer in general, to me just feels like it's working. You're hustling backwards. Like it doesn't make any sense, because at the end of the day, I'll be honest with you. Yes, I have a lot of technical ability, and Lord knows I've learned a lot of stuff through trial and error, not just through schooling and stuff like that. But the truth of the matter is, it's like, if you're just looking for somebody, even if you're like even if you're like an aspiring audio engineer, like you need to be so much more than the person that just knows all the technical stuff, because there's always going to be somebody that knows as much technical stuff or more than you do.
Absolutely. Looking for teams that is partnership, looking for people who are invested, like you said, when opportunities. That is a philosophy of mine. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And that's a part of your business model.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a part of a lot of people's business model.
You know,
so kudos for that, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. So having worked with over 300 podcasters, what have been some of the key milestones or changes you observed in your studio's approach over the years? And you touched on it a little bit, but can you elaborate a little bit more?
I feel like we've really been operating in a similar fashion. I would say like the thing is that I just have me personally, I've gotten better at being able to, I had things that I told people right when we started the studio, but I also got a chance to really observe not just what people were getting wrong, but like what people were getting right. And I think that was a thing when I've always been a person where I try to reverse engineer when I see something that's working. I'm like, okay, but why is it working? Like, why is this content good? And I've really have taken the time to just be consistent about listening about listening, analyzing, and observing. Like, it's kind of unfortunate in a way, because it's like anytime I either watch or listen to a podcast, like I'm always sort of breaking it down in terms of like, is something working and is something not working? But one of the key things I would probably say in terms of trying to answer your question directly is trying to this year I'm launching a podcast course of mine that's really distilled everything that I've pretty much already knew and learned along the way and over the last 5 years or so, from people who have done stuff poorly to people who've done stuff great. And it's really a course that is designed to help people with their podcast content, and also to help them organize and also help them sort of manage and run their podcast. Because I feel like those are the two things that people really struggle with, is making sure that they know that they're actually making good quality content that attracts the audience that they're actually trying to attract, which is key. And then the second thing is to actually learn how to actually run and manage your podcast. And that goes back to what I said sort of about like running it like it's a business. And I think me launching this course, and then also I'm going to be doing some official consulting this year, which is something that I kind of was very hesitant to do, largely just because I am a incredibly busy person, but I'm making the space and time to do it because I realized like that's what I really enjoy. Because like I said, there's nothing wrong with having more feathers in the cap in terms of like, I recorded this big name podcast, or I got to work with this person. Like, all that stuff is all well and good. But to me, like I said, the thing that really gives me the most joy not even just, it's given me the most joy the entire time, but I really want to focus on that with my business moving forward. Because to me, I really am trying to always think about how could I best be of service to podcasters, because it's not an easy game. So I would just really want to be a resource for people as much as possible. And I would probably say that's what I'm trying to do moving forward with the business.
That's awesome, man. There is an ecosystem to it all, right? And there are several moving parts when it comes to podcasts, when it comes to studios, when it comes to consulting, all of these things. And even inside of your business, this is a natural progression of things, an expansion of the work, especially if you've taken the time to do what you've done, which is listen and observe and support. So congratulations on acknowledging that this is the next move, and this is important move. There's much value in what you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. So you recently launched the Be Heard Volume 1 podcast course. This is what you're referencing now, right?
Yeah, it's a course that's actually probably by the time that this is out, it will be out. I'm actually going to be releasing it. I was supposed to be releasing it today, actually, but it's going to be releasing next week.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, but
all right. So again, you talked a little bit about it, but if you want to get into anything specific that you want people to really understand that they can expect to learn from the course, and who it's ideally suited for, is it for aspiring, new, more seasoned podcasters?
I would say so. I would say that this course is specifically one thing I definitely like to make a distinction of is, so like I've recorded all kinds of podcasts from scripted to drama to unscripted. And this course, I I mean, I could talk about scripted and stuff like that, but the majority of the types of podcasts that I record are unscripted. And for anybody out there that's sort of watching or tuning into this or listening to this, like unscripted just simply means conversational, meaning you haven't like pre-planned exactly what you want to say. Granted, you should have some bullet points or at least probably an outline of what you're going to say, but it's really geared towards those types of conversational podcasts. And the big thing that you can expect if you are going to purchase the course is I really wanted to make this a course. Like I said, it's really geared around content. And the reason why I'm so big on content is because if we're just going to be honest here, like then the number one, and probably say like the number one and number two reason why so many podcasters either get frustrated or they fail or whatever is literally because they will start blaming everybody and their mom for either not listening, people that they know for not listening or tuning in, or maybe they'll blame their marketing strategy. And that's not to say that your marketing strategy isn't important or anything like that. It definitely is. And I do talk about that in the course. But I think a lot of people either don't know that there's a huge elephant in the room, and it's that 9 times out of 10, the reason why you're not attracting the people that you're trying to reach is because your content simply isn't good enough. And one of the things that I really stress on for a lot of people who have met me, especially if you've booked a session at the studio for the first time, is like, I will always tell you that your content is not good enough, but obviously I do it in a very constructive way. And I will tell people what it is that I see that will make, where they can improve upon their content. Because the thing that frustrates me sometimes is like, I see people that have really great things to say. Like they have a really great things to say. They have a great point of view, but they just don't really understand like how to actually say it so that they're actually attracting the audience that they're trying to reach. And one of the things, just to give you like a little insight into the course, is one of the first things I kind of talk about is mindset, a mindset to have. And normally, if I was taking a course and someone was talking about mindset, like it's one of those things that I always feel is kind of cheesy. I'm just like, I don't really need someone to tell me, like, I'm locked in, I'm ready to go. I don't need you to tell you about mindset, but it's not one of those like cheesy motivational things to get you hype. When I'm talking about mindset is really setting expectations of what it is in order to make and run a successful podcast. And like we already talked about, one of those things, number one, is treating it like it's a business. And granted, if you've never run a business before, you're going to have some bumps and bruises along the way. Like there's no way that's unavoidable, but it's understanding that you are actually trying to run a business. It's actually pretty much the same as running a business if you are trying to do this seriously. The other thing I stress in terms from a content side of things is if you're not a known person, I always tell people and stress to people to adopt the mindset that nobody knows you yet when you're creating this content. And the reason why I stress for people to do that is because I've seen so many people who record their first episode, they sit down in my studio and they start having a conversation where they never, ever either introduce themselves to the audience, they never acknowledge the audience, they never address the audience. And sometimes they'll be starting to tell stories, like if it's multiple co-hosts, they'll start talking amongst themselves about things that really only they know. And I've seen a lot of people make this and many other similar mistakes where they end up pretty much not even realizing that they're cutting off the audience. So I really stress to people that you need to pretend that people that don't know you yet, especially considering like if you're not a known person, people don't know you yet. So in order for people to really feel connected with you, they need to get familiar with you. So that's one of the major things that I really stress. Another thing that I really stress too is if I were to say like what are some really key important points of a podcast episode, like the most important things about your podcast episode in terms of conversational podcasts is how you start the podcast, which is what I call the setup. And then the other thing is making sure that you're including some type of stories or narratives, because like I said, if people don't know you yet, the stories are a nice natural way for people to get to know you. And people sometimes forget to include that. They'll start talking, or for example, one of the things I stress to people is a lot of people end up giving their opinion on things. And the truth of the matter is, if you're not known to anybody yet, no one's really going to care about what your opinion is, even if it's something that they technically agree with. But if you're able to wrap what it is that you're trying to tell the audience in an interesting story, people are much more likely to hear you. I almost equate it to sometimes if you were doing an informational podcast where you're trying to give people quality information, sometimes they might tune you out even though they want that information. But if you wrap it in a story, it'll be much more likely for it to be heard. It's like similar to when your parents are trying to tell you something that you really need to hear, but you're probably tuning them out. But if they told you that same message wrapped in a good story, you're going to be much more likely to hear it. So those are some of the sort of basic things that I sort of preach. And then, I also mentioned how you start your podcast as well. I talked about the setup. Like I can't stress to people just how important how you pretty much start and frame a conversation are almost more important than like the rest of the conversation that you're about to have, because you really only have, I always tell people, you have like this much time to grab the audience's attention. And especially if someone is tuning into you for the very first time, you have even less amount of time for people. People are going to even have less patience if they are tuning into you for the first time. So you need to be able to frame that conversation in a way that is both clear and compelling. And those are like the two things that I always tell people when you're trying to create a good setup. It has to be clearly understood, and it needs to be compelling, meaning it needs to be something that's going to essentially hook people into the conversation. So that's just a little tidbit there.
This sounds very valuable, man, because one, there are people out there who are aspiring, and those limiting beliefs or those ideas, those big concepts often stop us before we start. Like, okay, well, I don't know how to do that, so I'm just going to just stay over here and never start the podcast. So in that way, it's very important. And then also there's this opportunity to pivot and shift and to learn what it is that may not be working, and then be willing to incorporate that into the success of the podcast. So I see this as very valuable. Yeah, I'm probably going to take it myself. So yeah, this is really important. And this is the other piece. And I want you to weigh in on this.
Sure.
Often I have a production company, and I do work for nonprofits creating podcasts. And oftentimes they ask, well, how long should the podcast be?
Yeah, I get that.
And I said, yeah, there's formulas, there's not formulas, there's opinion, there's not opinions. But my thing is that the world we live in today is not set up for attention.
It's a
right?
fact. It is a fact.
And so, yeah. And so if I want to even click play, I'm looking at the time that it is, right? Before I click play. And if it says it's 65 minutes or 2 hours, I don't got time for that. I'm not even going to click play. Right. And especially if I don't know who you are, or I don't know that there's going to be value,
100%.
I'm not touching the podcast. And it could be great. Even the Shannon Sharp and Cat Williams, that's amazing. It's over 2 hours. I have stopped and started that 3 times now. I don't have the time to sit here consecutively. Right. So it's one of those things. And at this point, I probably won't finish. There's enough on bites of it on social media. Right. So it's like those things, wanting people to even be willing to push play. There's a formula inside of that. What's your suggestion around?
So I have a very clear thing that I literally say the same thing to everybody, but I also caveat it a little bit. So I have a very simple principle. Your podcast should be as long as it's still interesting. That's my philosophy. I don't really have such a huge problem with it being so long as it's not dragging at any point in time. Because I've definitely seen a lot of people try to imitate like their favorite podcasters. You could pick a Shannon Sharp, you could pick a Joe Rogan, you could pick a Joe Budden, these people with 2-3 hour long podcasts. And they'll try to do that. And they'll try to do that as like their first episode. And I tell people, unless like, I don't advise you to do that until you're definitely more well seasoned at doing this. But as long as it's not dragging, I don't think it's as big of an issue. But what I will tell people is to go for something that's shorter rather than longer, especially if you're brand new to creating content. I think ideally, when I speak to most people, like the sweet spot is somewhere between, I would say the range is somewhere between 30 minutes to maybe 45 or 50 minutes. I would say, because like usually people base it around how long the average commute is for people, which is somewhere around 30 to 45 minutes. And I think that's typically a good time to aim for, but I tell people you don't necessarily need to work within those constraints. And there's nothing, I don't see anything wrong with the super long podcasts but people also need to realize the people who do that, those super long podcasts, they already know that most people are not going to consume the entire thing. what they're mostly trying to do is they know that they have this usually high profile person for a limited amount of time. So they want to maximize how many short segments or how many short clips that they can possibly get out of that and be able to put advertisement towards those things. So that's really what their goal is, in my opinion, when you're talking about those 2-3 hour long podcasts. Like those are what's it called? There's a reason why they're doing it. And it's not necessarily, in my opinion, in this day and age, it's not really with the thinking that everybody's going to consume it the entire thing, because I think they know, and I think we all know that most people aren't watching and listening to the entire thing. I know I'm not. But that's really what my thought process is in terms of like how long your podcast content should be. If you can rock for 2 to 3 hours, cool, and it all sounds good, that's great. You got a lot of clips and you have a lot of content that you can make off of that, but normally I would probably advise to be something shorter.
So, of the 2,500 podcast episodes you worked on, which project stands out and why?
Man, there's a lot. Unfortunately, I have a lot of recency bias. So there is a podcast that I was working on with a good friend and collaborator named Chad Sanders. He's the author of a book called Black Magic. He is a former writer on Issa Rae's show Rap Shit. What else can I say about him? He's had features in the New York Times, specifically around, one was like an article revolving around George Floyd. But long story short, I've worked with him on a couple of different scripted podcasts, and he has a podcast that's out. Literally, the last episode dropped last week. So that would have been like the end of pretty much around New Year's time. And it's called Yearbook. And the podcast is pretty much like it's a little bit hard to describe, but it's kind of like a coming of age story mixed in with a coming of age. It's a true life story around his time in high school. He's from like the DMV, Maryland area. And he just kind of had some crazy things happen to him all at once during like the last 2 years of him being in high school, including the death of a friend, someone else who also got killed while he was there. And the thing is, like, he went to a really nice high school, and there's like these dynamics of, like, Chad is Black, and there's these dynamics of growing up around a lot of white people and going to school with like a lot of white people. So there's that. He was also on a champion, like a almost championship, state championship high school basketball team. And it's just a very interesting, I call it like a slice of life podcast, where like you can glean so many different things. And he interviews the parents of his friend that got killed and a whole bunch of other people who pretty much saw one of the really wild year in his life that really ended up shaping him. And he went back to his hometown to sort of talk to people about how like this year or two shaped them and changed their lives too, including the girl's parents who he was friends with that got killed. So, but yeah, it's to me, it was the reason why I was really drawn to that podcast is because me and Chad have a lot of similarities of how we grew up, even though we're not from the same area. And it's one of those things where I think part of the reason why I really enjoy this project and really enjoy working with him and why he chooses my studio and working with me almost exclusively when it comes to a lot of his audio projects is because we have that sort of connection, I think having another Black face across from him to bounce things off of that has a similar background to his really matters to him. So I could give him that sort of extra insight in terms of whether or not things were feeling authentic. And I was really drawn to helping him with it. I mean, granted, most people will say like the credit that I have is just for recording it, but I think even Chad would say that. And one of the things I like to do, even with scripted shows, is to be that. A lot of times scripted shows will have multiple producers. So it's just like, you're not going to be giving them like hardcore content advice about all these sorts of things as I would with somebody who is just brand new starting out, because usually these scripted projects are funded and have multiple producers, like I said. But these people have been making and creating and writing the scripts for this project for a long time, and they haven't heard somebody with fresh ears. No one with fresh ears has ever listened to what they're trying to do. So whenever I get a project like this, it's like one of those things I always ask people, what is it about? What are we trying to do? What part of it are we recording today? What are we trying to achieve? What's the tone? What are we going for here? What do you want people to feel in this moment? These are all things that I ask people. And it's part of the reason why I think a lot of people, like I said, trying to be more than just the person that hits record. But that project came out amazing. And I'm really proud that I had any sort of hand in that project, even if it was just 2%, in my opinion, because it's not like I was the person that wrote it or anything like that. But that project really stands out. Also, earlier in 2023, I did a project called Love. I just liked the project because it was just a very interesting premise about, it's a story about AI. It's a real story, investigative journalism story about AI, people who have AI love chatbots, essentially people that, and the companies, the companies that create these chatbots as companions. Some of them are just for friendship and some of them are for love. But it was really interesting to see how far and how limited some of the AI is with these chatbots. And then obviously some of the helpful things that they're good for, and some of the things of like how these things could be, as these things get progressively more good at understanding us, like how scary some of this stuff could be. But I just found like the subject matter of that to be interesting. But also similarly, I had a similar hand in terms of being that extra producer in the room with fresh ears to be able to really help them with their content as well, even though they have fabulous, wonderful producers of their own. But those are two that really stand out. And I'm trying to think what else. I mean, I've recorded so many episodes. Sound design wise, I'll say this one too. This is kind of funny. Sound design wise, there's a much lesser known podcast, but still very fun. In fact, it did win some sort of local award. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the name of the podcast is called The Story of Heidelberg. It is a theatrical comedy retelling of Nazi demise. And I know that sounds like a really crazy premise, but essentially it's a comedy based around, it's a ridiculous comedy that I recorded with a bunch of talented voice actors. I actually did some voice acting in it, which is funny. I actually played the role of Hitler in that podcast, which is pretty wild considering I think the actor that they initially assigned it couldn't make it. So they just needed a third voice to do a bunch of yelling. But that was a really fun podcast, both sound design wise, because they really just let me paint the picture with sound. And there's some really fun scenes I was able to create. And yeah, I'd probably say those three projects really stand out for me.
That's awesome, man. And it sounds like these are really interesting projects. And to be in an audio engineer's space, right? And to be position, I should say, and to have a studio, and you get a sort of interesting world view
Absolutely.
for podcasting, which is great because podcast hosts, right, and podcast creators, especially when they're committed to their specific podcast, it's very horse blinders on and not really expanding the mind on what's possible, what people are actually doing out here. It's amazing stuff. And I think one of the things I'm hearing from you, and which I love so much, is that podcasting gets to look and feel a lot of different ways, right?
Yeah. And so many ways. Like, the one thing is, just to your point here, like, the one thing I always try to stress to people is just like, the podcast world is so much bigger than you think it is. Like, from a content perspective, it's funny that like video podcasting is blown up the way that it has. And this is no shade to video podcasting, but audio podcasting, if you're just doing audio only, it actually opens up the world for you to be able to do so many more things. And there's so many different types of formats that you can do. But yeah, it's one of those things I always try to stress to people. If you're looking for like some new ideas, one of the things I tell people, you can win on format alone to make your podcast distinct. That's one of the things I would like to see more of when it comes to people who want to start a podcast and realize like you can do more than just sit down and have a conversation with somebody, even though like if you don't have the audio skills is where you could add to your team or whatever, but like you can add some scripted stuff here and there, just a little bit, just to spice up things. And that will make your podcast stand out much more than somebody else who's just sitting down and trying to have an unscripted conversation that sounds good. Because at the end of the day, unscripted conversations, while they're very easy and natural sounding to the audience, I mean, it's a on the fly type of skill. Even if you're preparing for it, you're still not memorizing your words or anything like that. So I think people who could add some scripted elements to their podcast, I think you can really help separate you. And you can do that in a multitude of different ways too. There's no wrong way to do that. But, I'm always very excited when someone comes to me with a format that I've never seen before, which doesn't really happen all that often, but I think really lends itself to adding to a lot of creativity to help separate yourself.
Absolutely. And there's opportunity for that. Yeah. And I hope that when folks listen to this episode of the series, that is something they definitely take away from this. Because when you're listening to the same podcast, which is great and fine, and if you have your favorites, that's awesome. But when they are pretty much sticking to the same formula, and the same model, and then you say, okay, well, I guess that's the formula.
Yeah.
I guess that's the model. Then there is no distinction, right? And there is so much opportunity, so much to gain from you finding your own distinct way of delivering what it is that you want to create.
Yeah. Actually, can I give you an example of one too?
Please,
That one that's
please.
pretty interesting. So I actually talk about this a little bit in the course in terms of a format that I call the gamification format. And you can create like many different shows off of this, but a client essentially came through me one day and they're not doing their podcast anymore. It's two young girls who were trying it out, but they had a really interesting format. And the format was their podcast was essentially an interview show. But instead of it just being straight up normal questions, they decided to play this game called MASH, which I kind of remember when I was like a teenager or something like that. It stands for like mansion, apartment, something, house or whatever. But essentially it's sort of like this fortune teller game.
Oh,
that,
yeah.
yeah. That we would play when we were like teenagers or something like that, or maybe even younger. And it's just the thing that helps predict the future. So they would bring on a guest that they would play the game with, and then through them, because the game you have to like ask people questions about what kind of house, like depending upon whatever you landed on in the game or something like that. Be like, oh, what would your house be like? What would your career be like, or something like that? And then they would throw in some maybe more standard interview questions in between, but it comes off like it's a game, but it's really an interview in disguise. And I thought that was such a great format and something very different. Also, even something that's very popular, like I tell people about this all the time, I think Hot Ones is one of the greatest formats I've ever seen for a show. And Hot Ones, even though it's not technically a podcast, or it started off as technically a YouTube show, well, it is an interview show. And I think it does exist as a podcast now, because I think they take the audio and move it and convert it into like audio form and stuff like that. But I say all that to say, yeah, like you can win on interesting formats just like that.
Absolutely. And that should be a goal, aim. Everything will remain status quo if we keep it status quo. There's got to be a disruption in that. So I love that, especially storytelling is my thing. I started Afros in Audio because of audio fiction. I created an audio fiction. It had nothing to do with what I'm doing right now. This was a pivot. And so there are so many ways. And I think that especially folks from our communities, there is a lot of rich storytelling and opportunity. But again, it remains status quo if we stuck it in status quo. So voices like yours are so important to kind of be that disruptor. Sure.
Can I also just say something about like you? And the other thing I haven't mentioned too, I've had many conversations with Corey of Black Podcasters Association. And what I think what you guys are doing is phenomenal. Like, I know this is funny because this is our first real conversation we're having. And it's funny because like I've been wanting to try to chat with you and reach out to you for a really long time, but I've been watching from afar. And like, if there's one thing I can stress to people when I was telling you about it takes a team, but it also takes a village. And like, even if someone is not a direct person on your team, like it's very, to me, also like a thing I've noticed is the most successful podcasters lean on their networks. They lean on people that they know that are doing something that is somewhat similar. And I think it's very important that people, especially Black people who are podcasters or creators, to recognize that there are a lot of us out here that are doing a lot of great work. And I really try to encourage other podcasters and content creators to work with each other. Like all the knowledge that we need is really here amongst us. And that's not to say that if there's somebody of another race or whatever that you're friends with type, but like, yeah, that's part of your network too, or anything like that. But I'm just saying that to me, it's very important to take advantage of your networks because you can level up together much faster than you can alone.
Absolutely, man. I agree, which is point and purpose, right, of Afros in Audio and Black Podcast Association. This is necessary work, and being able to recognize that keeps us in the game because it's easy to just say, I've been here, I've done that, it's time to go and figure out something else. But this is important work, and recognizing that keeps us here. And that's the same thing for podcasting. Mm-hmm. Our voices are important. It is important that we increase the number of podcasts that are in the active marketplace by Black creatives. It's important that we are able to sustain the active podcasts in the marketplace. And so this is all a part of it. The work that you do, the work that we do is so necessary, man. So I appreciate you, man, for sure. Josh, it's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot from you. It's been almost a masterclass in a lot of ways. Again, as I am even stepping into the arena I do podcast production work. I am a person who would love to stay back there and not come forward, but it's time to come forward. And I recognize that. And so as I move into this podcast, as much as I know, there's still so much to learn, especially when I'm stepping in for myself.
And me too. Like I try to stop learning.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's our great news, right? Is that we know that there's so much more to grow. And so again, thank you so much for what you shared. Is there anything else that you want to share with the people before we close out?
Yeah. And it's something that I think is really important in terms of like going back to the two things that I said are like the things that I really like to focus on are making sure people have good content and then trying to run your podcast like it's a business. The one thing I haven't talked about yet, and obviously the amount of time I have is not going to be able to cover everything that I personally know about it, but I definitely want to talk about monetization for a second, because it's something that if you want to sustain your podcast, you're going to need money. And I think that's something that people need to not think about as something that comes later down the road, or something that like, oh, once I have X amount of dollar, or once X amount of subscribers or viewers or audience, that's when I'll start thinking about monetization. You need to start thinking about monetization from the start, like right now. And the reason why I want to stress this, it's even more important to me now, more so than ever, is I was sitting in on a webinar about monetization. It was really about people who are more doing scripted pods, but the majority of the people in this meeting were white, but all these creatives that are in New York City radio group. And it's pretty much anybody that does production in any way, shape, or form is part of this listserv. And I sat in on this, and like I said, the majority of the people there were white that were speaking, and they were talking about how they don't even start recording a podcast until they get something greenlit. And it struck me as something that's like, well, duh, that's how pretty much a lot of other forms of entertainment or media work. It's like, if you want to do a project, people don't even start the project until they get it greenlit and have the money for it. And I'm saying all that to say, I understand that not everybody is doing a scripted project or something like that. Most people probably doing something conversational. But one of the things that's just that mentality of being like, they're not waiting until later to try to monetize. They're trying to monetize from the jump. They're not trying to have everything come out of pocket from the jump. And the thing I guess I want to stress to people is that there are lots of ways to monetize your podcast. If grandma wants to give you $50, take it. That's monetization. You've just made money, and you're going to need that money. There are many ways to monetize, but I think the biggest thing I'm trying to say here is that you need to have some sort of monetization plan, even from the start. And if you don't have a good monetization plan, there are a lot of people that start podcasts where they just want to talk about anything and everything. That's literally how they will pitch you their podcast, which is an awful way to pitch your podcast, by the way, because podcasts about everything and anything almost never works. Let's just be honest. It's just really very few and far between, never works. But if you don't have some way to either, whether it's if you have a side business, to be able to market that through your podcast. If you don't have something that you can promote, if you don't have products that you make, if you don't have services that you make, if you don't have some sort of network that you can tap into already, whether it's nonprofits that you're connected to, whatever it is that you're talking about, if you don't have some way, if you don't have some way to sort of even just come up with some plan for monetizing your podcast, I would say in 2024, you might want to rethink doing your podcast. And I know that might sound harsh, but the truth of the matter is, if you're actually trying to do it seriously, it's just one of those things you have to know that you're going to need it. You're going to need money in order to do it seriously. And granted, like I said, there's lots of ways, even like from the Patreons to the crowdfunding sites that you can use. You need to figure out as many ways as possible. And really what I'm trying to emphasize here is try to develop a plan. It's going to change over time, but you need to start trying to monetize from the start. Please don't wait, because if you can have some money now so that it doesn't have to come as much out of pocket, that can be the thing that gets you over the hump until you maybe get the bag that you need to be up here, or something that's
Absolutely
a little bit more sustainable. So I know I didn't say that quite as succinctly as I wanted to say, but
yeah, it's great.
I really just want to emphasize that point to people.
Yeah. And a lot of times there's a piece of not knowing, right? People don't know what they don't know. So seek out the information. There is information out here. There's a course that's coming out called Be Heard. And then there's obviously the Afros and Audio Conference and Black Pod Collective and Black Podcast Association, all these places that are resources and support for your understanding of monetization, because forget the money, think about sustainability, right?
Sustainability.
Right.
That's what
It's a
it's
part
about.
of it. Absolutely.
It might not be profit, but as long as it's not all coming out of pocket, that's what we all, I mean, how many times you heard people be like, as long as I don't have to pay for it, like I would do it, even if I wasn't necessarily making.
Yeah.
Now you can make a profit, but at the end of the day, like that should be the bare minimum of trying to make it be sustainable all on
Right.
its own.
Absolutely. All right. So lastly, how can our listeners connect with you in Brooklyn Podcasting Studio to learn more about your services and offerings?
So very easily, I'd probably say the best way to learn about, if you're interested in the course, I don't know exactly what the URL is, which is horrible, but you can go to on Instagram, it's Brooklyn Podcasting, and there's a link in my bio for it there. If you're interested about Be Heard Volume 1, I also am going to get back to doing a lot of free pod tips on at Brooklyn Podcasting on Instagram. So you can also tune in there. If you want some podcast help, I do give out a lot of free advice. And some of that is on brooklynpodcastingstudio.com. There's a podcast help page there, especially if you're brand new and you're kind of stuck trying to figure out what to do content wise. I have like a little sheet there that can sort of help you out with some of like the most common things that I've definitely heard people get stuck with in terms of like their content and why it's not hitting the way it should hit. Other than that, if you're in the New York City area and you want to record with us, we're pretty well known out here. So brooklynpodcastingstudio.com. Pretty much all of our services are there. Our rates and availability are there. Come check us out. Talib, I know you've been into the studio, so you can attest to what it's like there. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Yeah, it's an awesome studio. And what was a highlight of that was after the interview with Raphael, we had a photograph together and we had the screen behind us. And that to me was like, nice. This is a nice addition. It says a lot about how you connect with your clients, but also want the experience to be for the people into your space.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
that's important.
So
So
since day one too. So
yeah, absolutely, man. So listen, I don't want to stop talking to you, but I know we have to. We're going to reconnect again. I definitely want to have more conversations with you. I want to collaborate with you. We're going to keep this connection going. So once again, Josh, thank you so much for being a part of this series. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate you, man. I'll talk to you soon. All right.
Okay, take care.